Good evening, welcome. My name is Nana Baumann and I am the Senior Advisor for the Arts at the American Academy in Berlin. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, Hamza Walker, I'd just like to extend a few words of thanks, especially, first of all, to you, Klaus, for hosting us here at Neue Nationalgalerie tonight. Klaus is not only the director of this wonderful museum, but he's also a trustee of the American Academy, and we are extremely grateful for his hospitality and for his enthusiastic support of our institution and its arts program. And as you will hear later on, how Klaus has also played an essential role in making monuments happen in LA. So he will join Hamza on stage after his lecture and tell you all about it, I assume. A very warm thank you as well to the whole wonderful and very hardworking team here at Nationalgalerie, Lisa Botti, Gregor Quack, Esther Madubuco, Cecilia Ritter, Maribel, Nicolas Cabello. You're all wonderful, and none of this would happen without your help and support, so thank you all very, very much. And last but not least, I would really like to express our deep gratitude to Marina Kellen-French and Andrew Gundlach, whose sustained support makes many of the Academy's programs possible, and without whom this ongoing collaboration and partnership with the Neue Nationalgalerie would simply not exist. It is thanks to them that we have been able to present Joan Jonas's Mirror Piece performance. They have contributed to the Festival of Future Nows and Perform Festival. They have brought us artist Catherine Opie and architect Kulapat Yantrasast, and they have brought us Hamza Walker here tonight. So we are very, very grateful for their generosity and their vision and their continuing support. And there are more programs coming, so please do stay tuned. And now to our speaker. It is a real pleasure to welcome Hamza Walker here in Berlin this evening. Hamza is a curator, writer, and educator, and currently serves as the director of The Brick in Los Angeles, an independent, nonprofit art space that has been one of the city's most important platforms for experimental and socially engaged contemporary art. The Brick had previously been founded as LAX Art in 2005 as a space for emerging and under-recognized talent in Los Angeles. When Hamza took over the institution in 2016, he expanded the program to include thematic groups exhibitions that engage with a wide range of local and international artists at every stage of their career. Under his leadership, the institution has been renamed The Brick and moved into a much bigger new building. Previously, Hamza served for 21 years, from 1994 to 2016, as Director of Education and Associate Curator at the legendary Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, one of the most respected non-collecting contemporary art institutions in the United States. During that time, he developed a curatorial program of exceptional range and ambition, working with artists including Pope L., Carrie James Marshall, Ito Barada, Francis Alice, Trisha Donnelly, Steve McQueen, Katharina Grosse, Joan Jonas, Pierre Ig, and the American Academy's Artist Fellow of this spring semester, Dawood Bey, who unfortunately just left Berlin 2 weeks ago. Alongside these solo projects, he curated and co-curated ambitious group exhibitions, among them A Painting is a Painting Isn't a Painting from 2015 at the Cadiz Foundation in San Francisco, and Teen Paranormal Romance from 2014 and Suicide Narcissus from 2013, both at the Renaissance Society. In 2016, he moved to LA and co-curated Made in LA, the Hammer Museum's biennial devoted to artists of the Los Angeles region, together with Aram Moshayedi. Since joining The Brick, he co-curated Reconstitution in 2017, and in 2018, he curated 2 further exhibitions, Sperm Cult and Solowit Pageworks 1967 to 2007. A focused presentation of works made specifically for reproduction in magazines, journals, and books. And I should also mention, in the spirit of full disclosure, that in 2021, Hamza and I collaborated on an exhibition called All the Lonely People, which I curated exploring ideas around isolation and hermitage, and I was very, very lucky and happy and grateful that you agreed to present the exhibition at LAX Art, which is what the Brick was called then. And I will never forget the collaboration. Additionally, Hamza curated the talks and public programs for the inaugural edition of Frieze Los Angeles and served as a juror for the Venice Biennial's prestigious Golden Lion Award. Alongside his curatorial practice, Hamza is also known as a distinctive writer. His numerous exhibition essays for the Renaissance Society I read, and I hope that's correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, will be published in a forthcoming publication from the University of Chicago Press. So I think it's supposed to come out this June, so that's not happening. Okay, a little later. So be on the lookout for that. Furthermore, Hamza has also contributed art criticism and reviews to Art Forum, Parquet, and numerous exhibition catalogs. I'll list some of your awards as well. Hamza is the recipient of the 1999 Norton Curatorial Grant, the 2004 Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement, the 2010 Ordway Prize, and most recently, he was named the 2026 recipient of the Audrey Irmas Award for Curatorial Excellence by the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. So congrats. All of this said, of course, the centerpiece of tonight's conversation is the now legendary, extraordinary, and fiercely ambitious exhibition Monuments, which Hamza co-curated with Bennett Simpson, senior curator of MOCA, and Kara Walker, the artist, and which was on view at the Brick and MOCA from October 2025 through May 2026. The exhibition brought together decommissioned Confederate monuments, many still bearing the marks of protest from the Black Lives Matter movement, alongside newly commissioned and borrowed works by contemporary artists, asking fundamental questions about public memory and national identity. The subject could not be more urgent. Despite the removals of nearly 200 of these monuments in the recent years, more than 700 Confederate monuments remain standing across the US, and there even is an active movement to reinstate some of them. The debate is far from over. Nearly a decade in the making, the exhibition stands as a remarkable example of sustained curatorial thinking and long-term institutional commitment. And the critical response was substantial. Monuments was the most talked and written about exhibition in the United States of last year, being called the year's boldest exhibition by the New York Times and the most significant show in an American art museum right now by the LA Times, just to name two. The accompanying catalog has just been published, major scholarly volume issued by Delmonico Books, edited by Hamza together with Hannah Burstein, and it is substantial and beautiful, and I think you can pre-order it now and it will start shipping at the end of the month. So we cannot wait to hear about this extraordinary achievement and how it all came into being. As I mentioned, Hamza will give a presentation and will then be joined by Klaus on stage. So please join me in welcoming Hamza Walker.
So I'll just say a few brief words. I'm going to show a film which was one of the pillars of monuments. It's a film by Julie Dash, the filmmaker best known for Daughters of the Dust, and the opera singer Devone Tynes, baritone opera singer, who's quite phenomenal. And it in part, again, it was key to the exhibition. People ask the question of memory, what gets remembered and why. This was important insofar as it commemorates the event that was the catalyst for the call for signs and symbols of the Confederacy to be removed from public places. And because of the subsequent contention around monuments, I feel as though it was actually overlooked. So having this piece in the show as a reminder that the removal of the monuments did not come about because we are an enlightened society that just at some random time decided, you know, these things should just come down. It's usually not how change happens, that it was paid for in blood, So this is a 10-minute film, quite beautiful. It was filmed in 2 locations, one of them inside of the Mother Emanuel Church, which is where the event took place. Well, the event itself. June 17th? June 17th of 2015, an avowed white supremacist, neo-Confederate, Dylan Roof, walked into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 of its congregants in cold blood. They were there for a prayer meeting. He wanted to start a race war. That event, 10 days later, Bree Newsom climbed up the flagpole on the South Carolina State House grounds, and she removed the Confederate flag, and that was the first act of civil disobedience in response to the shooting, right? That was 10 days before. That was the beginning of the public call and a kind of soul-searching, let's call it, and a real effort began after that event. So here's the film. It was filmed in 2 locations. One is inside Mother Emanuel Church, and the other was the Angel Tree, which is a 400-year-old live oak tree within Charleston. And again, I'd mentioned the event. One of the more remarkable things about the event, Dylan Roof, when he was apprehended, photographs began to circulate online of him with, Confederate flags, Confederate regalia all around him. And so that was when the call, because of those images when they circulated, that's when the call to remove the signs and symbols from public spaces began to get louder and louder. He picked Mother Emanuel Church because of its historic significance. He knew what that church was. That church is one of 2 churches where the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded. It was founded in South Carolina and Philadelphia, pretty much concurrently. And it was also the church where Denmark Vesey was planning what would have been the largest slave rebellion in the history of the United States, with some 200 slaves. But he was caught before it could come to fruition and killed. And then the church was burned down and had to, again, be refounded a second time, essentially. So that church has deep historical significance of which he was aware, so in terms of the degree of intentionality behind his actions. But one of the most remarkable things is afterwards, when he was apprehended, the families of the survivors, the families, they forgave Dylan Roof instantly, which was quite phenomenal. So the piece, in terms of, grace in the face of horror, made it quite a remarkable event, right? They didn't want to perpetuate his level of hate. So just wanted to locate that as one of the pillars of the exhibition. The other is Kara Walker's piece, which you'll see at the end of the presentation. So in terms of the exhibition's peaks and valleys, those are the 2 pieces that I think of as framing the show. And I thought it was very important to have the Black church in the house, to have this event commemorated and to take note. And so, what all else about the show? So there's the curatorial team. Me and Kara Walker, and as we like to always point out to the press, no relation that we know of. And that's a joke between me and Kara, and we're always excited anytime the press actually catches that joke and puts it out there. But if you know her work, that's what gives it its bite. So this is Mother Emanuel Church, right? Dylan Roof, security cameras going in. These were the pictures that circulated online. These are the 9 victims. And then 10 days later, Bree Newsom going up the flagpole and removing the Confederate flag. And for those of you who might remember the event, that's where, to commemorate the event, in its wake, Obama sang Amazing Grace at that church. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, he was a state rep and a political operative and a friend of Obama's. And he was the pastor of the church. So 2015, that's when the Mother Emanuel Church shooting took place. It took 2 years for the first monuments to come down. That was New Orleans. Mitch Landrieu, who was also, heeding the will of protesters in the wake of the Mother Emanuel Church shooting, and as well as a good friend of his, Wynton Marsalis, who whispered in his ear, they should come down. It took him 2 years to get legislation through the New Orleans City Council to remove 4, and those are some of the biggest, the 4 that came down in New Orleans. So New Orleans was first of all. Concurrent with that, Charlottesville, Virginia, they went to remove their monuments, but it was met with fierce backlash, protests that culminated in the Unite the Right rally. And this was the event that was, in some sense, this is where the idea for the exhibition came about. The counter-protests, after the Unite the Right rally, there were a wave of counter-protests across the country where people started pulling them down, or mayors said, look, we have to take them down for public safety concerns. Either people are going to yank them down, or white supremacists are going to come rally around them. So that was the first wave of removals. So between 2017 and 2019, but mostly in 2017, then you had stragglers into 2018, 40 monuments came down. And that's when the idea for the show came about. And that's when Donald Trump came out and said, there are fine people on both sides, right? So 40 came down. And then fast forward to 2020. Monuments, the activism surrounding the removal of monuments was one, it had its own lane. The other lane, going on in the background, Black Lives Matter. They were adjacent to one another, but didn't really overlap until 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. That's when 160 additional monuments came down pretty much by the end of 2020, within the 6-month period from June of 2020 to the end of the year, additional 160 monuments came down. That was a big deal to have those 2 separate lanes of activism merge together, and that's what this projection of George Floyd onto the Richmond Robert E. Lee statue, to me, signaled that merger, right, of those 2 strands of activism. But what it really represented, and we'd been working on the show since the fall of 2017. So the show was conceived, at that time there were only 40 monuments that had come down. And then suddenly in 2020, 160 more came down, and it was like, our sales were up, and this huge gust of wind just came along, right, to carry it. But what 2020 represented was, the show implicitly was about the relationship between present-day grievances and historic injustices, right? But that became wholly explicit in 2020, right? Black Lives Matter, their protests were aimed pretty much at structural racism, right? Racism as it kind of had been baked into society over hundreds of years. And the monuments activism, right, which was addressing historical avatars of white supremacy, right? So those 2 things coming together in that moment, and to me it's summed up just even in this picture, right? Right, so 150, 160 came down then. And as Nana pointed out, there are upwards of 900 Confederate monuments on the nation's memorial landscape. Only 200 have come down. So just to put things into perspective, right? And as we were working on the show, we saw the pendulum swing, right? From when they first started coming down with the counter-protests in 2017 to now, right, where there are active efforts to kind of put them back up. But in some sense, like a lot of the things now, that's overblown to some degree, right? The federal government, for example, only 2 monuments that came down were under the purview of the federal government, right? One of them has gone back up, and the other one that'll be put back up in Arlington Cemetery came with a $10 million conservation price tag on it. So, but it can't be understated, right, the role that the federal government at the top has in setting the tone. So these things came down. It's a matter of state, city, county, municipalities, right, that pulled these things down. They are not within the purview of the federal government, but there are still plans afoot to try to get them back up. I know that they're actively, the new governor of Louisiana, for example, wants to put them back up. So these are lenders to the exhibition, right? The city of Baltimore was key to the show, and we took 10 monuments. That's what could fit in the show, right? I think 16 total is how many we had agreed to on loan for the show, but we could only take 10 in the end. So these are the monuments that were featured in the show. And so now I'll show some images of the show itself. Oh, here are a couple things. These are from the city of Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery was the first capital of the Confederacy before the Confederacy moved to Richmond. And for those of you who don't know, the Confederacy was the Civil War, 1861, 1865. The Confederacy were those 11 states that seceded from the Union. So even though the Confederacy was only around for 4 years, right, it is it looms large within the historical and political imagination of the United States, right, just to put that into some kind of perspective. These street signs were borrowed, not borrowed, they came from the city of Montgomery, Alabama. Again, it was the first capital of the Confederacy before it moved to Virginia. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Montgomery was the site of both the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, right? So these historical strata are played out in the process of commemoration and naming of streets, with Rosa Parks and Jefferson Davis Avenues actually meeting, right? So when we contacted the city of Montgomery we wanted to borrow these street signs. Oh, Jefferson Davis Avenue was decommissioned. They changed the name to Fred Gray Avenue. Fred Gray was Rosa Parks' attorney, prominent civil rights attorney. He's in his 90s. He's still trying to sue people. Like, he's not gonna stop. He's gonna go out with his boots on. He is incredible. So it's now Fred Gray Avenue. And so in terms of monuments in the expanded field, to think about, the geographic dimension of them, this was an inflection within the show that I thought was very important. So when we went to borrow these from the city of Montgomery, we initially were saying, okay, yeah, we'll borrow them, we'll send them back to you, it's just a loan. And they said, oh, no, you don't have to send them back. You can keep them. And I was like, oh, wow, Southern hospitality. Yeah. And they said, you have to get your own stop sign. That's, we're not going to give you that. So I thought, oh, there's a limit to Southern hospitality. So these stones from Richmond, Virginia, and we borrowed a selection of these. This is the monument graveyard in Richmond, Virginia. In addition to the 4 or 5 monuments, I can't remember the exact number that came down, 6 maybe. They also took down the granite bases, the pedestals that they were on. And that's all of them. So that's a little more than a football field. It's like 150 yards. And the majority of that, just over half, I would say 3/5, is from the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond. Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy, that Robert E. Lee is the biggest. The mother of them all, one ring to rule them all. So just to give an idea of the scale, the statue stood 6 stories high, 60 feet high. 40 feet of that, 4 stories, was just the granite base. Right? So people think that it's taking down the statues. The statues relative to the technology, hydraulics, the weight isn't a problem. They're awkward in shape, but it's actually the granite. Taking the granite bases apart was millions and millions and millions of dollars for the city of Richmond. So these are just details of ones that we borrowed for the show. Hashtagged days without an extrajudicial execution of a U.S. citizen by police. And then it had a little tab there for counting, and it says 0. Right. So now here are some of the contemporary artists in the show, just a list of names, Abigail DeVille. And this is an abbreviated presentation, so I won't show Abigail's piece, for example, or Colleen Smith's piece. I don't think I have lots of Stan Douglas's either. Right. So there were 10 commissions and then pre-existing works. So here's the show. And as Nana mentioned, this was an invitation that I couldn't resist. I couldn't make me an offer I couldn't refuse, to put it in the language, the quote from The Godfather, because of Klaus. Klaus was at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles at the time, and he was the one who greenlit the show. And you did it, Klaus, I don't know if you remember, at the first meeting. It was like out the gate. He was like, this sounds phenomenal, I'll put Bennett on the beat. And it was done. So it took place at MOCA Geffen, which is a 40,000 square foot warehouse space in downtown Los Angeles. And it's in 2 parts. So the show it's 2 buildings under 1 roof. The show occupied 25,000 square feet. I can't remember whether it's building A or B. Right, so now here's the show. So there are the stones from the Robert E. Lee. And now when you enter into the show, this is what you would experience. Right, so that winged figure is the Soldier and Sailors Monument from the city of Baltimore. It was very important that they be shown some of them to be shown in their damaged condition, right? Graffitied, paint bombed, dinged up, dented. They are just as much artifacts of 2017 and 2020 as they are when they were unveiled. Right? So they're doing double duty, essentially. So the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and this is one, Klaus, that I was mentioning that I grew up with. The city of Baltimore, my family is deep Baltimore. I was born in New York, but I did grade school in Baltimore. And I went to grade school right behind this monument. And these things, when I was a kid, they were just like furniture, fixtures within the city. I didn't know whether they were colonial or Confederate. What I did know is that it referred to a past in which black people had no rights, right? So it wasn't, in terms of going up and reading the plaque, they didn't, as a post-civil rights child, they didn't, and the trajectory or set of ideals that my parents had instilled in me, these things didn't figure into that or have any sway or power over me. Ruxtall, Frederick Ruxtall is the artist who made this piece. It's interesting. Unlike the other artists who made Confederate monuments, a lot of them, they're simply guns for hire, right? They would make you Abraham Lincoln if you wanted, or they would do a Confederate. It didn't matter, right? What's the challenge? Pay me, I'll do it. Ruxtall was an ideologue. He thought that the lost cause would be the means, that would be his art would achieve its greatest expression at the service of the lost cause. The lost cause is an ideology, and the show is all about the lost cause. These monuments are all about it. The lost cause is a portrayal of the South as a noble victim, right? The generals fought for ideals that transcended slavery. So if you could distance the generals from something that is, morally aberrant, that is the precondition for them to become heroes, right? So the lost cause involves the downplaying of slavery. Has to be remembered, the United States, we don't agree on why the Civil War was fought. right? So I think that that's really, really important, right? So still, ideologically, right? So growing up, the argument was, it was for states' rights, right? But the question, and that's part of lost cause ideology. I mean, most 9 out of 10 historians now agree, no matter how you cut it, all roads lead to slavery as the cause of the Civil War. The argument about states' rights, they fought for states' rights, the homeland, right? But a state's right to do what? Right? So in the background, that's Leonardo Drew, the slab of cotton. Martin Puryear on the right, paintings by Walter Price. You can just barely see Roger Taney in the middle ground there behind the Martin Puryear sculpture. And so this is Matthew Fontaine Maury. William Sievers was the artist. Matthew Fontaine Maury, and here he's depicted as a man of science. He was an admiral in the Confederate Navy. I think he was the chief admiral of the Confederate Navy. He's also considered the father of modern-day oceanography, which is how he's depicted here. In a lot of cases, a lot of the Confederate generals were portrayed as upstanding members of the community, men of science, men of letters. But he, in terms of achievements, Matthew Fontaine Maury mapped the world's currents. No small feat. And he's considered, again, the father of atmospheric sciences, in part. So the globe behind him actually has the current patterns etched onto it. But Matthew Fontaine Maury also believed in 1850s, there was this idea circulating around the federal government, and it was called Pro-Slavery International. So Matthew Fontaine Maury believed that the future of the United States lay in a relationship with South America, Brazil in particular. So he wanted to use slave labor, despite the fact that Brazil had its own slaves. He wanted to use slave labor to extract mineral resources from the Amazon basin. So basically, he had a whole vision of imperialism using African-American slave labor. So it's Americans, Africans with axe in hand, I think is the quote that he used to refer to going down and extracting the resources. In the paintings by Walter Price, and this is perhaps the most art historical object in the show in terms of this allegorical base around the globe, right, which depicts the seas as the source of peril, and I think it might have some references to Matthew Fontaine Maury's biography interspersed with it. So Walter Price, the artist who did the paintings, when we approached the artist in the show, some of the artists we actually gave an assignment if they would take it. Some of the artists we just said, carte blanche, whatever you want to do. So when I did a presentation with Walter about the show, I said, okay, Walter, we'll stay in touch. You can tell me what you're going to do, think about it. And he said, oh, no, I already know who I want. I was like, wow, on the spot. He's like, Matthew Fontaine Maury is mine. Walter, young cat from Georgia, Macon, Georgia, he actually served in the Navy. And he did so as a means for the GI Bill. He wanted to go to art school. When he was 15, he saw a show of Henry Taylor, and he said, that's what I want to do. I want to be a painter, which is amazing to me. And how was he going to do this? I'm going to sign up to the Navy. It's like, nobody does this. I'm going to sign up for the U.S. Army in order to become a painter. So he felt an immediate connection with Matthew Fontaine Maury. So in his paintings, but he didn't want to lift a brush for him. So in the paintings, he's marched back and forth across the canvas. He soaked his tennis shoes with paint, walked back and forth, and it was a reference for him to the first thing that he learned with his cohort in the Navy was how to march. And he said it was very, very hard for a group of young men to learn how to act as one, how to act as a collective. And he thought of that as an underlying metaphor for marches, the civil rights marches, and protest, right? Becoming a collective, acting as one. And I don't think it's in terms of the we hung the paintings at the height of the equator of the globe, but also they resemble water. So I think a reference to Middle Passage, given Matthew Fontaine Murray's background as an oceanographer, is parked inside of these paintings. I think of them as a love child, Bruce Nauman, Alma Thomas love child, which is the America I'd like to see. So that's Martin Puryear in the foreground, Andre Serrano in the background. And the Puryear piece is in the shape of a forage cap. That was the hat worn by servicemen, both Confederate and Union soldiers, in the mid-19th century. That's the shape he used for it. Andre Serrano, the Klan photographs from 1990. Andre Serrano at the peak of his powers, you might know him, he did the famous photograph Pissed Christ, a lot of controversy, 1989, led to the defunding of the NEA, the cancellation of the NEA Individual Artist Fellowship. But right afterwards, he requested to photograph the Georgia Ku Klux Klan and was granted access to them. And they allowed him to photograph them because of his notoriety. Essentially, they said, look, you're infamous, we're infamous, let's get it on. So, game recognized game, right? And they're stunning portraits, right? Just as soon as you're repelled by them, say that's what you're also drawn to them. And it's the whole ranks, right? So there's the grand wizard or dragon, grand dragon, down to the foot soldiers. Those two, that's a female member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's a statue of Jefferson Davis from Richmond to the right. Roger Taney in the foreground, he was a Supreme Court justice who did the Dred Scott decision. That was pretty much the precursor, the undoing of the Missouri Compromise, which set the ground for the Civil War to happen. It's considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. These photographs are by Hugh Mangum. Hugh Mangum, photographer working from 1896 to 1922. 1890, have to be 1896. 1897 to 1922. Those are the dates on him working. He was an itinerant photographer, but largely based in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, as well as Virginia for a spell. But he did penny portraits. And the remarkable thing, he photographed in 1922. He passed away in 1922. 50 years go by. Negatives are left in a barn on the family property. The family decides it's going to sell the property, suddenly finds Great Uncle Hugh's contact sheets, glass negatives. They donate them to Duke University, the Center for Documentary Research. And it's pretty much taken 40 years, 50 years before this work was digitized and then came into the view of the public, right? So on those grounds alone, I consider him a contemporary artist. But what's amazing about these contact sheets is 1890, he's operating in 1897. That's a year after Plessy versus Ferguson. That's the coming of the formal Jim Crow era segregation, right? Which gets more and more virulent and fierce during the early part of the 20th century. So to see these contact sheets with black and white sitters, the idea that his contact sheets were a space of integration is quite remarkable to me. And also just the nature of the sitters. I might know these photographs of black folk individually, but I've never seen them as a demographic. So going through dozens and dozens and hundreds of his contact sheets, right, to see this is 2 to 3 generations outside of slavery. And the folks can get, enough wherewithal to get hooked up to have their picture taken, right, as far as a level of self-determination about how they want to be represented, right? It just makes me think about, the massacre in Tulsa, 1919, is that right? When they talk about Tulsa as the Black Wall Street, right? When I see this demographic, that makes that all the more palpable, right? So this is a passage. That is the memorial to the women of the Confederacy, and Karan Davis in the foreground. And this particular trio of works, and that's John Henry's photographs in the background, about mothers. The memorial to the Confederate women of the Confederacy, the daughters, wives, sisters. That statue uses the motif of the Pietà, right? So you've got a woman cradling a dying soldier, essentially. The idea being, the allegory there, like Christ, the South too will rise again, right? Karan Davis, that's a statue of her son Moses holding a Confederate general on a horse. The lore in her family is that she's a descendant of John Hunt Morgan, who was a Kentucky Confederate general. She couldn't verify that factually, but the piece is called Descendant. And it's questioning, what is her son, 13 years old, going to do with this legacy? And it's also modeled on a famous statue by Charlie Ray of the boy with the frog. And so opposite that are the photographs by John Henry. And this is not a commission. John Henry was working on this series called Stranger Fruit for 5 years. It is mothers holding their sons. He asked them to adopt the pose of the Pietà, black mothers and sons. Mothers fearing for their sons as victims of, this is a period when he was taking these photographs, 2016 to 2021 is the period. Black Lives Matter, right? Mothers, high-profile police shootings of young black men. He did these photographs in response. Mothers fearing for their sons' lives, right? So the setup being, white grievance, black grief, essentially. I like these two, right? Outside the home, 1940. Is it a time or a place? Inside the home. Right? So here's another setup. Biggest monument in the show, double equestrian against Hank Willis Thomas. For those of you who know the car from the show, The Dukes of Hazzard, it's a replica of that. It was called the General Lee. That's the only point in the show where we have the Confederate flag. It was a way to get the Confederate flag in under the auspices of popular culture. Right, and this double equestrian is Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Khalil Robert Irving, Bethany Collins. And the Bethany Collins piece, these are rose petals that she carved out of that block of granite, which is from a Confederate monument. So this is one of the pieces that deals with transformation. And this is a whole narrative behind it. But for time's sake, I want to Turquoise Dyson. This, like the Leonardo Drew piece and the Walter Price piece, a passage in the show that dealt with black artists using abstraction, right? But the question being how abstraction, or abstraction towards what end, right? So these irregular, Turquoise is interested in these spaces that slaves who would then become free for one reason or another found themselves confined within. So you've got Henry Box Brown. He's somebody who mailed himself to freedom. He literally had a box made, put himself in the box, and had him shipped across the Mason-Dixon line. Incidents in the life, Harriet Jacobs, incidents in the life of a slave girl. She had to hide in the top area of a house, in the eaves, a very small kind of crawl space up in the attic. And so Turquoise bases her geometries on those spaces. And in these, there's a black hole in the middle of these. They look like John McCracken's in terms of their finish. Right? They're finished with this highly reflective laminate. Right? But then you can peer into the center and it's just a void. Nona Faustine, this is the White Shoes series, and she passed away about a year ago. And she is photographed around sites in New York, sites that are either around New York City, slave auction sites, slave burial grounds, or plantation sites. And that's the artist. She's either completely nude or bare-chested, save for a pair of white shoes. So down in the financial district, I love this one, right, where the pedestal is also an auction block. I think this is a burial ground. I really like this one too. And so, people were thinking about the show, critics in terms of the dialogue between the monuments and contemporary art, which was never one-to-one at all, right? There was just as much of a dialogue between the contemporary art pieces. For example, Nona's work and Andre Serrano's pieces, right? Nona, completely naked, exposed, vulnerable, versus the Klan, right, who would completely cover themselves. And finally, this is the last piece in the show, well, no, two more pieces, but a piece and a half. This is the Robert E. Lee statue that was at Charlottesville, Virginia. This piece was melted down. This statue was melted down. It's the only one to have been melted down. People ask, what's happened to them? Have they melted them all down? Hardly. Charlottesville, it has to be remembered, was the site of the Unite the Right rally. 1,000 white supremacists descend upon Charlottesville, which is a college town, essentially, historic. Town is traumatized. The city, we'd been working on the show for 4 years. We asked the city of Charlottesville if we could borrow the two statues that they took down for the exhibition, and they said, oh, we got your proposal to borrow them. We really like it. We'll get back to you. And I said, great. 2 months later, we got an RFP, a request for proposals for organizations interested in taking possession of them, meaning ownership of them. So we were one of 14 organizations to apply. They had 2 to give away. We were awarded, the Brick was awarded the Stonewall Jackson statue. That's the statue that we gave to Kara to then make her piece. So we redeeded it to her. The other, which is the Robert E. Lee statue, which white supremacists rallied around, that was given to the hometown heroes, the Jefferson School of African American Heritage, they were the on the ground, they led the protests to take these things down in Charlottesville. So they took this piece. Right? So that's a photograph of the white supremacists rallying around the Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. What people don't remember about Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally is the rally that made national news. For Charlottesville, 2017 is called the Summer of Hate. There were 3 rallies. The first rally was this one, where the white supremacists held a tiki torch rally around the Robert E. Lee. The second was around the Stonewall Jackson piece. That's when they had a Klan rally around that one. The third was the Unite the Right rally. That's the one that got national news, right? So the Robert E. Lee statue was given to the Jefferson School of African American Heritage. They melted it down in order to give the bronze to an artist to make a new piece. So in the meantime, and they were our sisters in arms, we'd been communicating with them before the RFP came out, and we said, hey, after they were awarded that statue, we said, can we borrow it after you melt it down for the exhibition? So there's the Robert E. Lee. So in the show, we have the Robert E. Lee in substance, but not form. Right? So that's what the installation of that piece looks like. So that granite piece is from the base of the Robert E. Lee. It says this white supremacy crumbles, but the crumbles has faded over time, which I think is already telling in and of itself in terms of the swing of the pendulum. The other 2, that's the bronze, the melted down bronze, and to the far left, that blue container, those are the impurities from, which I find this incredible, the layers of metaphor that are to be had. It was a cheap grade of bronze. So when they melted down the bronze was too toxic to actually, by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, by government standards, they couldn't give the bronze to an artist to work with. They had to actually purify the bronze. So a lot of it was lead and tin. So those impurities are in the blue barrel, and there's a glass jar on top so that you can actually see that, and that's a nod to Popel. Popel was one of the artists who was going to be in the show, but then he tragically passed away. And so Bennett and I thought that, if he would have taken joy in anything, the idea of the impurities from a Confederate monument, right up his alley. So now this is the Stonewall Jackson that was deeded to the Brick and then redeeded to Kara for her piece. So that's the statue part, and we also had to take the granite base as well. That was part of the deal. So that's what Kara did to it. Right, so she took it off of the horizontal, I guess that's the x-axis, is that right? And put it on a y-axis, right? She made it totemic. But she still kept the semblance of horse and rider. So the head is there, but not the face. She removed the face. She didn't want that as a point of identification, right? People could come in and say, there he is. Right? The only other part, at least recognizable part that isn't in the piece is the tail. And that was just, I was there when she decided not to incorporate it. She just said, look, I'm not under any obligation to include all of it. And when she designed it, she pretty much designed, it was done, she did a computer rendering that was very, very accurate. Right? But then in terms of the interior, there are parts and pieces that she could put inside the thing. The hand holding the sword is one of the areas that's completely re-engineered so that it looks like it was part of the original, right? But clearly that is not something you would ever see in any monument, memorial, statue, as it's a gesture of utter defeat, right? Dragging the sword by the wrong end. And that's the ear that she put inside of the, and the piece follows a logic. She wanted to remove the rider from the horse. So all of her cuts are pretty much towards that end. So as expressionistic as the piece appears, there is a logic towards both its disassembly and its assembly. So in terms of removing the rider from the horse, that was the first part. In terms of how she took the horse apart, she followed a butcher's chart. So she looked, she could have cut the horse any number of ways, right? But she chose to cut it the same way that we carve a chicken, right? You cut along, major muscle groups, right? So I thought that was interesting. So that's the head that you can see with the kind of part of the leg jammed into where the face would be, right? And art historically, this piece is the gift that keeps on giving. It's Guernica, it's Muybridge, it's Futurism, it's Cubism, Surrealism. So then, now that's what the base, so this is what she did with the granite portions of the base. So I don't have the thing I didn't include. What you're looking at here, that round semicircular part, below that are these carved allegorical figures of faith and valor, but they're face down, right? So there are two semicircular end caps on the base. So with the one end cap, Kara has these, if you popped off that semicircular end cap and then just put it down on its face, that's what that is. And Kara, she did her kind of iconic black silhouette work on what were heretofore unexposed surfaces. So this one is called Ghost. This one's called Tread. And these were shown out back. There's a courtyard area. And this is sandblasted granite. So in terms of a positive-negative process, she did her silhouette work on pieces of white adhesive-backed vinyl. Right? But first, she had the surface of the stone covered in a black paint that's particular to granite, because granite's one of the most dense stones that there is, and it's a crystal, so it doesn't absorb paint, but this is a special paint. She had it covered in that black paint. Then she did the silhouette work on the vinyl, adhesive-backed vinyl. Then she applied that to the stone, to the black surface. Then she sandblasted it, right? So then she removed the vinyl, and that's the black surface, right? That was it protected it from the sandblasting. So that's how so they have a lip, like, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch lip when you're close to them. She kept that cement that's around the edge of the stone. Cement was the mortar, the pieces, and this is the last piece. So this is one of the flanges. Underneath this piece, it has Stonewall Jackson's name and his life and death dates on it. And this piece is called Star Spangled. And so these stars, exploding stars, which are the symbol for Juneteenth. It's a symbol for new beginnings, essentially. But I really think it's quite beautiful in terms of, there are the stars in the sky, but the texture of the stone, it looks like the ocean floor. And so just that mirroring I find quite beautiful. So yeah, so that's it on the presentation side. So yeah, that wasn't too long.
First of all, a huge thank you. I want to talk perhaps about moments a little bit. You are here in Berlin, and I asked, shall we go and see the Kiev Biennial this afternoon? And I thought that was a big tour, and then we were kind of the only guests, and the team and the two curators, and it was very intense to do it without a group, but to be the group, and they both talking to us. And it was also so intense because then at some point we asked, where are you from, and where do you live? And the question arose, do we live in times of war or peace? Where? I don't know, did you feel that a little bit?
Well, that's, the best way to answer that question is going to be with the title of Kara's piece, which is Unmanned Drone. And so Kara, if you know her work, it's usually she has longer titles that tend to be kind of lyrical. And she came up with that as a title, and then she wasn't certain about it. She said, and because when she told me the title, and it's great because it's such a counterpoint to the piece. Unmanned Drone brings it instantly to now. But, and then there's the reference to the unmanning of the horse. But the notion of a drone isn't just, the unmanned aircraft, but something that's going on in the background, right? That's just there, right? So to characterize, Jim Crow or not even Jim Crow, to characterize events from 1865 up into the present in terms of, historically the treatment of black folk as a low-grade kind of warfare, right? That goes on. So that's how, in terms of a response of temporally where we are, right? And I thought about when she mentioned unmanned drone, the first thing that came to my mind was the line from Public Enemy, 1989, Fear of a Black Planet, and it's a great track. I don't think I've bought a rap record since then. My older sister and my brother-in-law will attest to this. This is what I mean by anti-nigger machine, is the track I'm thinking of. So when she said that, I was like, oh yeah, this is so, just in terms of those sentiments are not new, right? She's just kind of revoicing, a sentiment that at least was laid down on that track. So in terms of what time is it, and ways to think about a kind of the protracted struggle, right? And along the arc, right? So that's what's in that name,
You made it a very light-hearted, as if light-hearted. You said, and we met and we decided we do it. It was very light-hearted, but it wasn't light-hearted. Because I think we talk about moments, so we had that moment deciphering peace or war, here, there, where is where, when is when and where are we? And when and where are we, 2020, you mentioned George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And just to describe moments in time, I just give a very subjective, wrong description because I'm very delusional. I remember George Floyd happening, and with a little time delay, the bomb exploded everywhere. You felt it. And I remember I was in downtown, and we had Barbara Kruger on that very museum, the American flag, as a Barbara Kruger, of course, you know that piece, it's so commonplace. And we had made that so big, it was a whole gigantic wall of the Geffen where the show was in. And I walked down and I photographed it and I posted it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be home, so I posted it. And then, but I remember, I think the idea of institution is very important. The institution, so, oh God, I posted something. But do you remember that moment where we were all paralyzed because we didn't know how to react correctly, and then all museums went mute? Mm-hmm. For example, on the social media, you are not on social media, but we all went mute, and then we went mute for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Oh, I was so happy I had posted something immediately, so nobody was waiting for me to post something. And then it was a week, and it was 2 weeks, and we couldn't react. Mm-hmm. Remember that moment of complete paralyzation?
Sure. I mean, but it's funny about things like this, and when does race get produced? And I would say race gets produced, in terms of difference, but it's not difference meaning difference of perspective, right? And how these things are contextualized. So George Floyd, that stuff, that's been going on for so long. This is just the one that got videotaped and played nationally. But you also have to think, that's what happened with Rodney King. Even before the internet, somebody had a videotape and they happened to catch it. The thing about the Rodney King beating on the LA freeway is that's exactly what happened in 1965. It was a driver who got pulled over, police brutality. That's when Watts burned down. So it's the cyclical recurrence of things. So that on the one hand, it loomed large in like a white liberal imagination about what this event was, whereas black folks is like, nah, see, this is what has been going on, and Black Lives Matter basically with that long, roll call. You got to think Ahmaud Arbery, right? Sandra, like this was, if you did a count, at least the Black Lives Matter roll call, this was like George Floyd was the 18th, I think, in terms of ones that had that kind of level of national visibility, right? So, my board had asked about, like, should we post something online? And I was like, no, that's too weird because I can't post something online, like, because all it's going to really betray is, for me, it's like a black director writing. That's a level of alienation that I can't even begin to think about. So we didn't post anything, and I was like, no, just nothing. No, we're doing our work. That's what we have to say. Like, that's not in social media to me. Since I don't do social media, my thing was like, what is our attention span for these things? So, I didn't feel that urgency. But with that thing about time and memory, the thing I'm talking about, it's like I was saying, no, that's the one that everybody suddenly sees. The same thing with like a newspaper. If you look at a newspaper, who remembers what and why? So whenever I go see my family in Oklahoma and we would talk about like a police shooting, and they would say, well, what do you mean? Do you mean the boy that got shot in the 7-Eleven parking lot? Or are you talking about the one that happened in Tennessee, 2 weeks ago? And that stuff circulates. That's how, it's just like, that's a form of collective memory on the part of black folks in terms of like, no. That story that's on the lower right-hand side of the newspaper is the one that gets read or looked at, but it's remembered because of all the other things. So the thing that I was saying about what made 2015 really made the country, like, and you got to think, Nikki Haley, this is Nikki Haley, she was governor of South Carolina. She moved to then have the flag taken down, right? So at that moment, people really, that shooting shook everybody. The reason it shook everybody is because it referred back to 1963 in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. That was 1963. That was a key turning point in the civil rights movement. 50 sticks of dynamite were put in a black church. That's when it's a famous film by Spike Lee, The Four Little Girls. So to have 9 people shot in cold blood well in the wake of the civil rights movement is suddenly to call into question what, if any, progress has happened since then, if that event can happen in 2015. So what you're saying about like what gets remembered by who and why, I think that's a really telling thing. Like who remembers what and what does it then refer to, right? So things friends were asking about, like, it's like, well, what I saw in the monuments coming down in 2017 in the counter-protests was not, there was all the contention in the white supremacists, but that's not what I was seeing. Was like, yeah, there's that. But taking down these monuments is huge memory. In 1997, Bill Clinton thought about issuing a national apology for slavery. He issued an apology to the leaders of West African nations. He issued them an apology for the slave trade, but he never issued a formal apology for slavery in the United States. And so Bill Clinton, the supposed first black president, people were like, Bill, what the fuck is up with that? So he said, all right, let me think about it. Then he did the whole series of panels on race relations in the United States in 1997. And my friends were like, does anybody remember this? So I was like, no, I remember that. Because it's just like, the idea that he was going to issue a national apology on slavery is kind of a big deal. But what would an apology for slavery have sounded like with 900 Confederate monuments on the nation's landscape? So for me, when I saw the things come down, I was like, oh, there's the apology. It's like, are we ready to actually say this? So that's what I was seeing in the things coming down. But again, how these particular events, it's not just like they might paralyze us, but it's like, no. What are they connected to? What are they symptomatic of, right? Like, are we able to add up the dots?
My recollection is that I was very impressed that you weren't paralyzed. You were doing your job, you're working, and you had a very ambitious plan. Of course, what's what you have to say is just, yes, let's do that. But in the background of the being paralyzed, that was quite unique at this point because it was very productive. 5 years go past, and 5 years later, there is like a nervousness about monuments opening. It was quite a nervousness. And all of a sudden, I was asked if they can blame it on me. I decided that. That was your last show, no? And everybody thought monuments is going to explode.
Yeah.
Did you think it's going to explode? Was Trump back in office and in the US that we now live in, or not? I'm not anymore.
Well, during the show was 8 years in the making, so I mean, like I like to joke with people. Well, we in those 8 years we saw MOCA directors come and go and come and go. Like in the same with the president, we saw a president come and go and come back again during the length of the show. So I didn't have any fear about, despite the fact that there was backlash, because exhibitions are complicated things, and they're relatively static things. And they can't be, with Kara's piece, it could circulate online and people could jump on that and say, oh my God, look at this horror. Yes, and it did circulate in the right-wing online echo chamber of sorts, but that's about it. Because it has nothing to do with exchange of ideas or discourse or all the kind of altruism that undergirds what it is that we do and why. Because that side of the fence is not going to come see the show, right? So that was always my feeling. It's like, okay, I'd be shocked if they actually showed up. Now, there were people who did come, and I mean, they spoke out, but not in they may have said, I think they should go back up out loud or something like that, but there was only one that was escorted from the museum, but that was because she kept bothering other visitors, pulling out her phone and saying, see what this thing looked like originally? But, so those did nothing came to pass, but we had to be prepared, right? Because in terms of the language, it only takes one crazy. So the biggest line items for the show were security, a PR crisis firm, and extra lawyers on the show. So the closer we got to the opening, it's like, whatever that fundraising goal was, it's like, yeah, we hit the fundraising goal that was from last year, but now the fundraise, it's just like, okay, we gotta raise more money in order to do this. Now, The Brick, where I'm the director, and MOCA have two different risk thresholds, clearly, right? So we could only move as fast, or we had to think through the lens of MOCA as an institution, large museum, in terms of the risk in them having the, bulk of the show. So they were the ones driving that risk threshold assessment discussion, which I think was, correct. Knock on wood, nothing happened, but we had to be prepared. One, we had to be prepared because, and not because people thought, oh, an event, something could happen. Yeah. But if we aren't prepared, the internal staff, they felt uncomfortable. So just to have the museum staff agree to work the show, we had to have the security, right? So it was like, yeah, we have to be ready for what's out there, but what's in here is the staff, they won't do the show if they don't feel safe. That's square one. So that's really what was driving the decision. Like, we cannot mess around with security, period. That's a non-negotiable line item. It's gonna be what it's gonna be, and we're gonna pay.
Another way of looking at moments, I had a meeting earlier today where the director or the person who runs one of the most beautiful, beautiful movie theaters, Kino International, it's on Karl Marx Allee, and came by and we talked about movies and we talked about how you classify what's classical or what's 20th century and what's contemporary. And he made a very easily understandable definition. He said, for me, everything that predates my birth is classical. So I'm born
I like
later. I thought, wow, great, thank you. And then I realized, I used to do that as a kid. I always thought that was when I looked at a movie or whatever. I always looked, I was already alive, or that was before my time. I was reminded that I do that. And then I was reminded of early memories of a work of art or something happening in the world. And then that was just half an hour before we ran into each other here by coincidence in front of the show. Two museum directors, two museum curators meet in front of a museum exhibition by coincidence.
Fancy that.
Hours before we were meant to meet. And I said, we were in the car together, and I said, when are you actually born? And we realized we were born in the same year, 1960. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
1966.
I just know.
So we were born exactly the same year. And I remember when we were in the car, I said, when I was a kid, I always thought I was born only 21 years after World War II. As a kid, I was obsessed with the fact that it was only 21 years. It was not even a lifetime. And then I asked you, what are your measurables, or what do you measure your life against? And then I thought to myself, shut up. And then I said, when was Selma? And you thought I'm referring to a name, but I refer to a movie a friend of ours made, Ava DuVernay. And it's actually a movie from the March to Selma to Montgomery. Yeah. And I looked it up while you sat there because it's 1965.
65.
The March for Voting
Rights is Selma.
It's 1965. That's a year before you're born.
Yeah.
And then we were in the Ukraine exhibition, and I said, when was it again with Martin Luther King? Because I'm always mixing up numbers. And you said 1968. So the March for Voting Rights is 1965, and when you were growing up and becoming a curator, what were you? I think I left Germany because I was born only 21 years after World War II. I'm not kidding. I mean it. What were your I call it measurables, of course, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. So that's, I mentioned the statues not having any hold over me, and it's generationally, me and Kara, and we've known each other for 30 years, and I mean, Kara's, as far as a kind of generational mirror, right? When we did her show in January of 97, so we met in 96. When I first saw the imagery, or her silhouette imagery, I said, oh, no, this is somebody from the irreverence that they had with the past marked her as somebody of my generation instantly, like just without thinking. And I was like, oh, yeah, she's a fine post-civil rights child, making the doodles and the drawings that would piss off our grandparents, right? So we weren't just post-civil rights children, we were post-roots children, right? Meaning the 1978 television miniseries, right? This is where the narrative of slavery is going to be told on national television in 3 parts. So to see, which became parodied the next day that we went to school. So you'd have to understand that as much as for all of its gravitas, it also became this kind of fodder for adolescent jokes in a way. And so I thought of Kara's humor as coming out of that kind of cauldron, right, in a sense. But the two of us as post-civil rights children, at least, I mean, certainly in her case, no doubt. I mean, I know her father, Larry Walker. We both would have gotten the same message, which is you are born into a world in which you will have opportunities and be able to do things that our parents and grandparents would say that we could not do, right? So, go forth. So that was really clear, right? That there's a dividing line, that there's a mark, right? That you are about to inherit. The Civil Rights Acts, that marks the birth of a new, or the rebirth in some sense, of a new black cultural, political subject, right? So, being made aware of that as a child, that's what I meant by the monuments didn't have any, they were from the past, right? As opposed to growing up late 60s, coming of age in the 1970s, when race relations were being renegotiated, socially, politically, culturally. What are we to one another, right? So that's more the trajectory or mindset that made it so the monuments were completely like I said, colonial Confederate. I didn't know the difference. All I needed to know was that it was from a past in which the rights of, my ancestors were highly prescribed. So the fast forward to 2017, well, then there's 2015, which again was a big deal, but 2017, to see white supremacists then rally, like to see them, but it wasn't to say that they, at the same time, Karen and I both knew, like, no, those harbor, that can be stirred up. That kind of sign and symbol and what's underneath it in terms of a kind of nationalism, right? That is what they're there for. So even though they were dormant, to still recognize, like, okay, if you kick it, this is what you will get. And so in 2017 to see, oh yeah, Bear's definitely been, more than poked in the eye. So, as far as a relationship, if that's what, you were asking in terms of what markers in a life. Again, being a post-civil rights child, and you were asking questions about, I remember, now, you mentioned Chernobyl. I know exactly where I was when that happened. I was actually in Europe when that happened, and it took me a long time to pronounce it Chernobyl because I was in France, so it was always Chernobyl. To me, it's like so wacky. It was in Chernobyl. I was like, I don't get it. But in terms of marking events, and I was like, oh yeah, Iran, right? The hostage crisis in Iran, huge one as far as these events that would then, markers again, And then fast forward to things like 97 and Bill Clinton's, misstatement, or 2015. So those things are there in terms of marking periods and moments. But yeah, but in terms of the civil rights movement, being quite conscious of being born, and being made aware that this, this is a new world, in part.
It's interesting when you try to remember where exactly you were.
Yeah, the rain, the patterns of rain, because all the fruit, the crops in France. That
Have that too?
Yeah. It was huge. They had to destroy all these crops, and it's like, pissed off French farmers. That's a serious pissed off. Like, that's the French farmers. When they had to destroy the crops of berries, it was just like, it's like, oh my God, this is,
I grew up near the River Rhine, and there's always Rhein in Flammen, which is fireworks on the Rhine. And it was the day after, and the fallout rain fell on everybody. I was like running, leave the rain, go home, take a shower. They all thought I was like crazy. So.
Yeah.
Is there progress?
I'm an optimist. I mean, I do not subscribe to, I would want to believe that there is progress and that there continues to be progress. I do not subscribe to the, ain't a damn thing changed. It's like, no. Yes, it's like the pendulum can swing, but I do subscribe to the larger arc of history as it bends towards justice, in some sense. What else? What else is left as an alternative? Becoming really cynical? I can't. That I can't do, So
that explains why nobody can say no if you have an idea. So I think we should open it up to questions from the audience. And I think since it is a little late-ish, and we are hugely grateful that you shared so much, but shall we say 3 questions? And yeah?
Hamza, thank you for your talk. Enjoyed it. The simple question, where is Kara Walker's sculpture going?
MOCA.
MOCA.
Purchased the piece, so it'll stay in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's the statue is the statue, and they're all separate pieces. So the granite-based pieces will have another life also.
Thank you so much for this really incredible talk. I wanted to ask, did you use any monuments from other countries? Because they were also torn down in like the UK, for example.
Right. No, one of the ones that got away in terms of public programs. I want to do a whole public program about comparative discussions internationally about the kinds of socio-political crises that lead to these moments, right, when they come down. So the U.S. context is totally the U.S. context. The Soviet context, is its own thing. But to begin to get a better handle on these, in some sense, but we couldn't. It was chock-a-block, and even though the show was up to 7 months, you always think, it's an eternity. That wasn't the case, and it wasn't necessarily just internationally. In terms of, but other subject matter. So in a couple instances, when we wanted to borrow the statues, they said, well, we got a Christopher Columbus too, if you want. I was like, no, we're fine. We got plenty of narrative on this end. And then it being in Los Angeles, a cat who's a dear colleague and a critic and a writer, he said, I love this show, but I'm gonna write something about it, and I'm gonna have to give you a hard time. And I thought it was great that he told me this the day before the article comes out, and he goes, it's in Los Angeles. How come there are no monuments to, the Columbus that was taken down here, or the Junipero Serra statue? And he said, but I also already know your answer to it. And he was right. And he said, well, if you do, so you suddenly decide, we have to have a representative because of the Latino community in Los Angeles. It would have been a token gesture. I wouldn't have been able to take it on with the depth that it deserved. So better not to do it and to make that decision. So he knew that. And I thought that was great that he said, but I still got to do this.
Maybe would be a question for Kara Walker herself, but I was wondering, you were telling us that the that she tried to make the statue unidentifiable. But then I wondered, because there's this arm laying in front of the statue.
Yeah.
And as I just read up, Stonewall Jackson died from infection or something, like the aftermath of getting his arm amputated.
Yeah.
So the question would be, is that like on purpose to make like kind of a mockery out of it, or?
It was a reference to his death, but I think so Stonewall Jackson died in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War, and he was one of its key generals, along with Robert E. Lee. I mean, both are very celebrated in terms of, as strategists. And Stonewall Jackson, I mean, he did a series of victories that completely stunned the Union. So 1863, he was actually shot in his arm by friendly fire, actually, and then died 8 days later after a battlefield amputation. So the arm that's lying in front of the piece is a reference to Stonewall's manner of death, but it's not in any way meant to be a mockery, despite the fact that it's a reference with that kind of specificity to it, even though she removed the face of him, right? So it's a contradiction there, right? She wanted to keep the specificity of who he was, make a reference to it, but at the same time not have him there as the point of identification, so that I would say, obviously, thoughts, ideas, the imagination can go elsewhere with the piece, right? So when she talks about it as being, she referred to the piece as being cathartic, right? And what it, and this is just in response to you talking about it in terms of tone of the piece, and tone was of utmost importance to the entire undertaking, that people did not feel as though they were being made fun of, which was key to getting the trust of the lenders, right? So to deal with the cities. So dealing with the cities, I worked for the city of Chicago for 5 years as a public art coordinator, so I knew how to, I know how to navigate that kind of bureaucracy, and that came in handy. So when people said, how could you even think this way? I was like, nah, working for the city for 5 years, I knew that with these things coming down, I know that there's a bureaucrat somewhere in that machinery that you can call and talk to about this, right? And other people don't think, it's like, oh my God, the city of Chicago. It's like, no, somebody's back there. You just got to get the right person. So making them feel comfortable that nobody's being made fun of was really, really key throughout the exhibition. But the tone of, and it really had to be excluded from the show, not just for the lenders from the cities, but also when it came to getting permission from Mother Emanuel Church to film that inside, to make that film inside that church. That was much harder than getting the cities to agree to lend. Like, in terms of having to come correct, like, really to have to talk to a church. Because the basic thing, I'm not from Charleston. So the whole question is like, who are you to come up in here and want to talk about our tragedy and suffering? So knowing that they were very, very gracious and stuff was key. But that was, so in terms of tone, that had to be established right quick, So Kara's piece, in speaking about it being cathartic, again, in terms of what the piece, it's really nice to see Black folk come and see the piece. And it wasn't a response necessarily to violence, right, which is what that piece has inherently to it, but that's not what the response was really about. The response was really about the action, that what she did to that statue makes us feel heard in a way that we've not felt heard before, right? So when the whole contentious about this thing, the first thing you hear with those on the right, these are our heroes. This is history. You are trying to erase history. These things have nothing to do with history. They're completely myth. So you can't even get past this. We can't have a conversation. So what's really happened over the last X number of years is a lot of shit that Black people just don't even talk about. They just don't even want to go there because they just feel like, I don't. And that's the nature of the relationship. It's just that, right? A kind of silence and stuff. Because it's like, I don't think you're ready to hear this. I don't think, what would it really look like? If we really were to have this stuff, what would it really look like for you to take this shit down, right? And then we could really have a conversation about what the past is, who should be remembered, what ought to be remembered, and why, right? But until you can see the reaction that you get just from taking the stuff down out the gate, what it is, that's automatically, that on the other side of that is the black silence. So taking it down. So what Kara did in terms of letting something out, watching black folk respond to it, that was the feeling. So when she called it, when she said cathartic, right? And so one of the right-wing press things online said, oh my God, if this is what cathartic looks like to her. And that's the whole idea about fear of like, oh my God, this represents black rage. You know, because it's like, please. You got Mother Emanuel Church, and they're willing to forgive Dylan Roof. So in the reaction to this, it's like you want to see what rage, you know. So.
Whoa, thank you.